Well, hello again, folks. It is still Strategic Bombing Week here on WW2 TV. I don't know if anyone was around for the show earlier when Tom Lewis is talking about the attacks on Australia, but now we're back into the ETO again, but not Germany. We're talking about Romania tonight, which is something we all should know a bit more about. And I've got a fantastic guest for you. We're just talking in the before going live. I had 3 people recommend our next guest in the same week. It came in. I was aware of him anyway, but it just the timing, 3 people recommended. So Dr. Luke Truxal is joining me from the USA. Evening, Luke. Afternoon where you are. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good. A couple hours, I guess, maybe after this broadcast will be tea time.
Yeah, indeed. So Romania, World War II. It's one of those areas that I think in terms of the air power, everyone has a little bit of an idea about it. And if people are playing the Ploesti bingo card, we are going to say that word a number of times. But there's obviously, as we're going to find out, a much bigger story about the country as a whole. It's not just about oil fields. But in your work as an academic, an air power historian, what is it about, before we get into the presentation, what is it about Romania generally that you find intriguing?
Wow. What I guess it's kind of one of those things that happened by accident. I was doing research on my dissertation, which looks at, as kind of a side issue and as a part of it, the oil plan. And as I was starting to get into the Karl Spaatz papers, I found out that the bombing of Romania was far more extensive than simply bombing oil refineries, and that is something that I found absolutely fascinating when you look at attacks against really, transportation targets, railroads, mining. It was quite extensive. And then as I looked a little bit deeper, I found out that there's actual coordination between the Americans, the British, and the Soviet ground forces. And looking at how that coordination took place in the air and ground war was also pretty fascinating. And as I keep looking into it, I keep finding more stuff. You got Cold War history, you got diplomatic history, you got Romanian history, American history, British history. It's just all there. There's just so much happening at one place and one time. And it just keeps on giving. I keep learning more each day about it.
And I haven't heard you speak on this yet, but in just looking in the PowerPoint you sent me, it was the connection with the ground warfare that I was like, that's where my eyebrows went up. I thought this is going to be really good because, as I said at the top of the show, I think we all have a bit of an understanding of the B-24s and the famous raids, but there's a much wider context that I think will be interesting, but also make that what we do know more interesting in turn, because we'll connect it to some other stories, if that makes sense. So without further ado, we'll get on with things, and then as usual I will jump in with comments from myself and from anybody watching, and there are quite a few people here, which is good. So for geography first, people who are not familiar with the map of Europe, Romania is a long way from the Great Britain, particularly. It's a long way from a lot of places. So run through the basics of exactly Romania's role in World War II, just in case anyone doesn't aware.
For those, again, the reason I always start off with the big map, and I like, kind of how we start with the big map here and showing where Romania is for the casual person who's into World War II. They may have heard of Ploiesti, but they don't know where Romania is. It's on the Eastern Front. It is a big participant in the Eastern Front, whereas the Italians played a major role in the Mediterranean theater, and they also committed a ground army to the Eastern Front. Romania has 2 big key contributions in that they'll be contributing a lot of manpower to the Eastern Front, 2 full armies at Stalingrad, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, but also the crude oil. Germany doesn't have a lot of crude oil on its own. It has a lot of synthetic plants, but not a lot of crude oil on its own. And so Romanian crude oil becomes a lifeline if you want to carry out this kind of mobile war that the Germans want to carry out. So I think the Germans had a word for it called Bewegungskrieg, mobile war. And you can't carry out mobile war in a modern war without oil and gas. And that's why Romania is so important to the Axis. It's the oil and it's the ground forces as well, significant ground forces.
And it's interesting because until you kind of said in your PowerPoint that it is part of the Eastern Front, I don't know that my brain really connected it as being part of the Eastern Front. But of course, logically it is. But because I think of bombers coming from American bases, I kind of think of it as ETO. And yeah, and it isn't. And it's sort of, that was like a moment when I said that. It makes complete sense. But yeah, and that's what we're going to learn about this context. And interesting, in our first show with Don Russell on Monday, that was about synthetic rubber and rubber in Ruhr Valley. It is incredibly important, like with James yesterday talking about Phillips and the valves and glass. You know, rubber, it's not just the obvious things like tires, it's seals and valves and gas and respirator and oxygen masks and all those incredible many things that rubber is needed for, seals on water bottles, all this, that, and the other. So without rubber, the German war machine is crippled. So we know where it is geographically, Romania, and it's part of the Axis. It's part of the Axis. So how did that, in case anyone doesn't know who's watching this, Romania, what's their story in terms of becoming part of the Axis powers?
Largely the reason why they become part of the Axis powers is you got to remember that they are next to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is a communist nation. Romania has a number of issues with the Soviet Union and with communism. First, the Soviet Union has taken aggressive actions. I believe the annexation of Bessarabia prior to the hostilities breaking out between Romania and Germany. That is one of the major reasons why you see Romania join the Axis. Soviet aggression is one of them. Another that you have to consider is, and again, this is something that I would say is a little bit outside my expertise, but I've already told you about another historian who knows probably more about this than I do. But there is kind of a religious element to this as well, that, the Romanians are very religious in their beliefs, and they kind of see communism and that, I guess, atheism, or that non-state religion or non-religion whatsoever. They have a real big problem with that. And so you see these two areas where you have a border conflict where they have already been forced to give up territory to the Soviet Union. Then you add in kind of the cultural differences. That's going to lead Romania to move more towards the Axis and be inclined to join the Axis and be kind of a fascist state. And Prime Minister Ion Antonescu was an ally of Hitler. He is effectively running Romania as its prime minister, even though it has a king, King Michael. So he is effectively in charge at this time.
And effectively, they've got to pick a side. They're between two conflicting empires, and they've got to pick one. And it's the lesser of two evils, I suppose, when they make that decision. And yeah. So, but we now we'll turn to the air war in Romania, and there is this traditional narrative that I kind of mentioned there. But I want your take on what the narrative has been, historiography terms, for these last 7 decades since the war.
In the historiography, and kind of what most people hear about, and what I get asked about most when it comes to Romania and Ploiesti, it's always about the oil refineries. The Ploiesti oil refineries. Everybody wants to talk about the low-level raid. Everybody wants to talk about the 1944 raids on Ploiesti, and it's always about crude oil. The problem with that is it's missing the bigger strategic picture. We always focus on the oil. The commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, Karl Spaatz, was obsessed with destroying Romanian oil. And so we get kind of almost like, the only way I know how to describe it is almost refinery focused. A lot of books will talk about the attacks on the refineries, the production numbers. And I myself, I've also written about some of this. And yes, you have to include production numbers and look at these attacks on the refineries. But because we get so focused on this, we miss the wider picture. It's almost like we get too target focused on the refineries, and we miss the attacks against railroads. We miss the attacks against refugees, an air suppression campaign. And so that's kind of the problem here, is this traditional narrative is always about the 15th Air Force bombing Romanian oil, and particularly the target itself, which is the refineries. So it's almost like we get focused on the targets and one set of targets, and we forget about the rest.
It's almost got that Dam Busters kind of connection in that sense. I mean, and doing my prep for this, just looking on YouTube, and you can do this yourself, folks, there's an awful lot of content on YouTube about the raids on the refineries, including the German footage and American footage. And there was a Ronald Reagan narrated film made during the war. And it's stacks of stuff comes up. But if you do the Google search on YouTube with a minus sign in front of Ploesti, nothing comes up. It's basically, it is all about the oil refineries and nothing else beyond it, which I think is really intriguing.
And also, if I wanted to even be a bit more bold, I would say that it's almost entirely about one city, Ploesti. Yeah. You hear a little bit about Bucharest, but you don't hear about Patitsi. You don't hear about Galati. You don't hear about all these other cities that are getting just blasted by the Americans. And also the mining campaign by RAF 205 group gets completely forgotten about. And it was a very effective mining campaign, which you would think that the RAF would want to talk more about, because it is one of the more effective aerial mining campaigns of the war.
I mean, we'll talk perhaps about why we think that story is better known than others as perhaps we go on. But right now, let's talk about what you do want to talk about. Let's talk about something different, and let's carry on what you want to say. So that's the traditional narrative is it's all about the oil refineries. And I'll move on through your PowerPoint there. So here we go with some of your points here.
So what I like to do here is what I've figured out is we keep focusing on the targets. We need to take a step back when looking at Romania and kind of do what we did at the beginning of this presentation, which is what are Romania's strategic contributions to the Axis? Why do they matter? Why are the Allies interested in knocking Romania out? Because they become quite obsessed with knocking Romania out. And it has to do first, as we pointed out, with the Romanian crude and synthetic oil, but also the military contributions in terms of ground forces is quite significant. For those of you who may not be familiar with the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, they were on the flanks of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. They got steamrolled by 2 Soviet fronts. Ironically enough, and some viewers and you might find this interesting or ironic, it's that those same two armies will be on the flanks of the German 6th Army in Romania during the second Iași-Chișinău offensive in August of 1944. And the exact same thing is going to happen. 2 Soviet fronts steamroll the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, and the 6th Army gets trapped. 6 is just a bad number for the German army, it seems like.
Yeah, there's a bit of a spirit about that number, and and their involvement in Stalingrad, I think, is overlooked. I think it's the Russian or the Russian or German-made film in the 50s, I think, talks about, because the German officer in that is attached to Romanians. But that's going back 50 years. That movie was out. But I think since then, as I did the show with Neil Lawrence about the Italians, it's starting to get a lot of people have kind of forgotten about that, because we've talked about it so often on World War II TV. It's the simple trope is the one that gets remembered, and the more complex picture just seems to get lost in time. So yeah, the strength of Romania as a military power, I think, is something that definitely is. I'm glad you brought that up. It's very important.
Yeah, again, I would say amongst the Axis powers, you have, the Germans, you have the Japanese, you have the Italians, but right below the Italians, you have the Romanians, who are a quite capable power themselves throughout much of the war until the very end. The second part of this PowerPoint, basically, when you take a broader look at what is Romania's strategic contributions to the war, then you get into what the Allies are going to think of, okay, how do we eliminate this threat? How do we take out this strategic target that is contributing crude oil and ground forces to the to the Axis? And so the first that I'll obviously talk about, one of the first things we'll talk about is direct attacks on Romanian oil refineries. That's the one that everybody likes to talk about. That's the one that gets the most coverage. The next is you'll see in 1944, an air interdiction campaign to isolate Army Group South Ukraine. So there'll be this attempt to basically isolate them by bombing railroads, bridges, mining the Danube River, and basically strangle any form of supplies and at least slow the flow of supplies and movement to Army Group South Ukraine, making it easier for the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts to attack and drive into Romania, which they try to do twice, unsuccessfully in April of 1944, much more successful in August of 1944. The third, this is something I came across. Again, it was one of those things you came across in the archives you don't intend to find, but you find. There is also this attempt. Richard Overy, who's written on the air war as well, talks about attacks against Romanian civilians. And what he doesn't get into is that there's more to it than that. There is an attack. There are attacks done against Romanian civilians as an attempt to internally weaken Romania and make it kind of, I guess you could say, ready to just kind of fall to the Allies. But also there is an attempt to weaponize refugees, is what I call it. Basically, you bomb. There are refugees fleeing the second and third Ukrainian fronts as they are coming. And there's an idea of, well, if you bomb the railroads on the route out of Romania, we'll flood the roads with refugees. We'll flood the cities with refugees. They won't be able to get out. It'll slow any type of flow of supplies and movement to Army Group South Ukraine, but also it'll hamper any efforts to retreat, and it'll really destabilize Romania. So there's this attack against civilians, both refugees and Romanian civilians, to try to internally bring about the collapse of Romania without the use of ground forces. It has limited success, but there was a really active effort to do that. And finally, something that the Allies discovered in May of 1944 is that the last really big air formation the Germans had on the Eastern Front, Luftflotte 4, it's still pretty active and it's still a viable threat. And it does a pretty good job at repulsing the Soviet, the Red Army's air forces as they try to provide close air support to the second and third Ukrainian fronts. And as a result, there becomes this concentrated effort of, we need to eliminate this if we're going to basically lay the groundwork for a ground offensive into Romania. So those are the means of kind of achieving that strategic objective.
So it would seem to me that this is probably the primary example of actual cooperation between the Western Allies and the Soviets in terms of their both shared interests. Because we talk about this idea that, you know, the attack into Italy was to kind of appease Stalin and this, that, and yeah, but this seems to be a real lot of cooperation. So when you say the Allies were looking at this problem, this issue of civilians, who are the people behind this? I mean, you mentioned Karl Spatz earlier on, but who are the movers and shakers in terms of recognizing Romania as an important a part of the war?
I would say there's two key figures that are the most interested in driving this, at least the air support side, to the Soviets and that is Karl Spatz, the commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, but also the chief of the Air Staff, RAF, Charles Portal. Portal and Spatz share a lot of communications. And also, I would say Ira Aker, as the commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, also CC'd onto these communications. And there's a lot of back and forth on how to bring about the collapse of Romania. And it's the Western Allies, the RAF and the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe that reach out to the Soviets and say, hey, our air forces are getting closer. Just to avoid a conflict, we need to maybe set up some bomb lines or exchange liaison officers. But also, we have a shared interest in eliminating Romania. Let's find a way to work together and achieve this objective. So the reach out is definitely happening on the from the British and the American side. It's almost a real hard courtship of trying to get the Soviets to say, okay, let's do this. Because the Soviets, I mean, as you know, with the Soviet Union, with Stalin at the head of the Soviet Union, they do operate from a level of distrust of the Western Allies. And so there does have to be this kind of convincing of, hey, if we do this and it works in Romania, we can do it in Hungary, we can do it in Yugoslavia, we can follow it up and make this kind of a thing as we move further and further closer to Germany. So,
yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. So, you know, the elephant in the room is the Ploiesti raid. So yeah. we do have to talk about it. We couldn't not talk about it in a show about Romanian air war. So, but I'm really interested in your take on it.
This was not a sure thing to happen. There was a lot of planning put in, but this is one of those things that, in my opinion, while it is a great feat of aviation, they were able to fly at low level and attack these targets. It's a complete disaster in terms of military objectives achieved. The idea was that you launched this one raid at low level with 178 B-24s, and you'll hit the oil refineries and you'll send, the Axis powers reeling due to the oil shortage. Well, there's a lot of problems with this. One is that one of the commanders that you need to probably coordinate this with is the commander of the 8th Air Force at the time in 1943, which is Ira Eaker. Eaker is completely opposed to this. Eaker wants to bomb the ball bearing facilities at Schweinfurt. In fact, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid happens on the 17th of August. And he wants, in fact, there's a whole fight over the 3 B-24 groups that goes all the way up to George C. Marshall. And Ira Eaker goes as far to exclaim that basically Spaatz and Eisenhower stolen his B-24 groups that were loaned for this raid. Eisenhower wants the B-24s not for the Ploiesti raid, but for air support in Sicily and Italy. He's just using Ploiesti as an excuse to take the B-24s. Spaatz wants them to bomb. So we have a problem. Nobody agrees on whether or not we should do this. And if you ask the majority of the people in the room, they don't want to do it. They think it's going to be risky, it's going to be costly, and it is. But also something Eaker points out is also too correct, which is you can't just hit this one time. If you hit this one time, they're going to rebuild it. And you're going to have to hit all the oil facilities if you're going to do an effective oil plan. You got to attack synthetic oil in Germany. You got to attack all the crude refineries in Romania. So if you're going to do this just one off, the long-term effect it's going to have, they're just going to rebuild it. And you're going to lose the overall cumulative effect of a consistent bombing campaign against oil. So why even do it? And what happens is Eaker proves to be correct about this. They do the raid, they hit some of the refineries, they do a lot of damage, but at a great cost. 3 B-24 groups are basically put out of action for the foreseeable future. I think in terms of loss, we're talking about 54 planes were lost in the raid, aircrew losses, 310 killed, 130 wounded, and you didn't achieve the strategic objective. You did a lot of damage, you caused a lot of problems and headaches, but all you really served to do was basically tell them that they need to probably shore up the defenses at Ploiesti and rebuild those refineries. The cumulative effect is never going to really occur. And so the exact thing happens that Eaker predicted. They rebuild the refineries, they beef up the defenses, and what short-term advantage they had is lost long-term.
But you can completely see the point of view, given the losses, that doing and following it up with another raid, very quickly afterwards, or even a few weeks later, would have, if they had trouble getting this one off the ground, getting a second one after losses on the first one, it was a losing battle. But so in the end, they get it wrong twice. They do the raid, and then they've had the losses, and they don't even capitalize on it and think, well, okay, well, let's do it again. I mean, that's all Monday morning quarterbacking, looking back in hindsight. And I guess that's why it's so discussed.
And what's interesting is Eaker predicted all this, in their debate when they had this huge fight. But something else that I guess doesn't get pointed out enough about the failures of the 43 Air War, they don't have enough bombers for anybody. So a follow-up raid is really in question, even if they give everything to this raid. How long can you keep doing this to maintain the cumulative effect? And they're not going to have enough bombers till 1944 anyways to really go at the Ploiesti oil refineries and basically maintain that level of attrition, both in terms of their own losses, but also to maintain pressure on bombing the refineries. So it's not really till 44 that they have the resources to do this, which again begs the question, if you don't have the resources to maintain a steady campaign against it, and nobody seems to agree on this, why do it? And it basically came down to Eisenhower wanted to retain control of the B-24s, and he knew that he had to launch the raid to keep them, and that's why he did it. So.
And it is interesting, with just one of the recurring themes this week has been the progression and development from 42, 43, 44, and 45. And by when Tony Redding joins us tomorrow, what the Allies could put out in the air in 1945 was worlds apart from what they could put in the air 2 years earlier. A maximum effort was a real maximum effort in 43. It was leaving no reserves, no one behind. And And not just in terms of aircraft. I'm talking about personnel as well. But by 45, the system is almost clogged up with replacement crews right now. So it's been a theme of the curve of improvement is massive,
including putting pilots that are not mentally stable back in the air, guys that have suffered basically after missions. They need time to take a break, not just from sleep deprivation, but from the fighting itself. And you see accidents happen because they're just being overworked and mentally exhausted at this point in the war as well. You see a lot of that in 43, where guys are just being pushed beyond what they really should be capable of doing.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the human toll is something that, in all this talk about the politics and the grand strategy, the toll on air crews is something that's is always worth mentioning. But your next slide is Eastern Front. So how does this all connect with the Eastern Front?
Well, something I always like to point out is that, the next major effort against Romania doesn't really come until the Eastern Front gets within range of the B-17s. And by this point, with the invasion of Italy, which is so important, even though it sometimes gets kind of put off as kind of a sideshow, invading Italy becomes incredibly important because by acquiring the airfields at Foggia, and I don't know if I said that right, but by acquiring those airfields, you can now put a strategic air force there, the 15th Air Force. And once the Soviet advance in the south gets within range of Romania, then you can start seeing the Americans coordinate air operations in support of the Soviet advance. And so you don't really see a renewed push towards Romania until those ground forces really come back within range. And then that's when the oil plan and Spaatz' oil plan really starts to gain momentum, because it seemed like, okay, we can really do this now. We have the numbers. We have ground troops now threatening. We can really maybe make a push at this. And so Spaatz was always interested. Let me make this very clear. He was always interested in bombing Romanian oil. He didn't need an excuse. But it helps him get more allies on his side to advocate for going after Romania when the Soviet ground forces get closer. And when you look at the early defeats, you see Ukraine steadily, being taken back by the Soviet Union. You see German forces having to evacuate Crimea, and you see this advance getting closer and closer to the Romanian border. The communications about what to do about Romania and how to help the Soviets or execute the oil plan that Spaatz has come up with, which is bombing the refineries, that really heats up as the Soviet advance gets closer. So when you look at the Soviet victories on the Eastern Front, there is a correlation between the communications between the Western allies and guys like Portal and Spaatz. That heats up the moment that the Soviet forces start threatening Romania and they get closer. So as the advance across Ukraine gets closer, that's when we see this being taken much more seriously, rather than just kind of something that they're planning out, that they're thinking about. It moves beyond that.
And this is why I'm really hoping that people watching this I really find that it's somewhat revolutionary. The connection between the ground war and the air war is really important, and it's what I'm taking away already. And we're only halfway to the presentation, so we're up to the spring of 1944 now. Lots happening around the world at that time, but let's talk about this.
What's interesting is this offensive gets kind of forgotten, partially because in June it ends in June of 1944, which is kind of, I guess you could say, it's bad timing for this offensive, because you have the D-Day landings, you have the fall of Rome, the liberation of Rome. So it kind of gets sandwiched away and pushed back. But it's an important offensive, because what happens is the Soviets launch two army group size formations called fronts at the Germans in an attempt to seize Romania very rapidly, capping off their success in Ukraine and in Crimea. And what happens is it is at the same time that this is occurring that Portal and Spaatz had these series of communications where they say, hey, let's immediately do what we can to help these guys out. Because if we help these guys out, if we help the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts capture Romania, we permanently turn off the oil flow to Germany. It is immediately off. We don't have to bomb refineries. It's off. It's occupied. It's over. And so we can achieve that strategic objective just by carrying out a massive air interdiction campaign. And so this is where we see a lot of these communications heat up right on the eve of this. And in fact, it's not a coincidence that the first major air raid against Romania since Ploiesti was on 4 April of 1944 at Bucharest, which is the Bucharest marshalling yards and also any other train stations in Bucharest. And so when that occurs, when it hits that major rail junction and the capital of Romania, for those of you who are not familiar with the geography of Romania, Bucharest is the capital, but when it hits those marshalling yards and those train stations, it really shocks the Romanians because they've never seen anything like this. The previous attacks have been against the refineries, and it's a very devastating attack. It's very effective, and immediately there's more communications between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union on how to coordinate this better. And in fact, I'll go ahead and point out that there's an intelligence officer in the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, a guy by the name of Group Captain JCE Luar. Google him, you'll find like maybe one thing to him, and it's he's on like I guess the list of like the honors on one of the birthdays or something like that. But he gets mentioned in dispatches. But he's an intelligence officer, and he basically comes up with this massive air interdiction plan on how to carry out an air interdiction plan on how to coordinate and help the Soviet advance out by attacking basically targets that would Romanian transportation targets. And so this kicks off kind of a reach out to the Soviet Union. And this is what brings us to kind of this next slide. What you see happen at this time is there's a lot of communications between the Soviets, between Major General John Dean and initially General Alexei Antonov, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Soviet Armed Forces. At the time, I can't say his name, Rokazov, can you help me with that name? I'm really struggling.
Folks, we did this before we went on. I couldn't say his name, and now Luca's caught the same bug now. Rosakovsky.
Yes. Yeah. But he's even though he's the chief of staff, he's not actually doing a lot of the staff work. That's being done by Alexei Antonov. And what happens is Major General John Dean and Antonov start kind of coming together and negotiating on how to develop a plan on how to coordinate all this. The Americans want to do liaison officers. Let us put some liaison officers with the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts. You give us liaison officers, and we can kind of coordinate this whole offensive. Well, the Soviets don't want to give direct access to the ground forces. So they come up with this. So this is the system that was a compromise system that they agreed to. And it's a pain in the rear, but it works. Basically, if Spots wants to bomb a target, he would then communicate a list of targets or proposed targets to John Dean in Moscow. He would then reach out to a guy that had been assigned as kind of the liaison officer to John Dean, Major General Nikolai Slavin, and he would kind of be the liaison officer. Slavin would then take that onto Antonov, and Antonov would then talk about that with the ground commanders and probably with Stalin, would be my assumption. I don't have any direct communications, but my guess is that would get communicated up to Stalin. Then it would go back on through the line, and it'd be yes or no, and if there was a counter proposal, it would come through that same channel. It's a lot of it. There's a lot of middlemen in this. So you kind of have this kind of, system that takes a long time to get a mission approved, but it works. And what they come up with is kind of a general parameter of targets, like these targets are okay, these targets are not okay. They establish bomb lines. So this is how they coordinate in early 1944, during the spring of 1944 and the summer of 1944, through this kind of system that is established by the Western Allies. Again, Spots communicates with Dean, Dean communicates with Slavin, Slavin communicates with Antonov, and it goes right on back down the line after the Soviets decide on what is okay and what is not okay.
Well, it may have been complicated and convoluted, but again, we must consider the fact that even 6 months later, it would have been even more difficult, because by then the chessboard has moved on. We're beginning to start think about post-war Europe. We had that in a show about Yugoslavia, where anything that kind of aids the Soviets is now becoming a different prospect entirely. So it may have been difficult, but in early 44, we are still absolutely wanting the Soviets to do their part because the war is yet to be won. So it's an interesting period.
Yeah, and while it is flawed, it works. I will say that. Spots and Aker will complain about the lag time, but it really, really does work. And we see, and I will say it also helps head off any type of problems that occur as well, because later on in the war in Yugoslavia, the Americans accidentally dive bomb and attack a Soviet armored formation and kill a Soviet general, and basically they have to go right back through the system to try to sort it out and basically issue the apologies. So it works really well despite the lag time.
So we get to the first interdiction campaign, which is, as you say, was early April to May. So transport. So I'll hand over to you to explain more.
Well, traditionally, what you'll see in kind of most books about this interdiction campaign is they'll say, well, Spots was really using it as an excuse to bomb the refineries. So they count the oil campaign as starting on 4 April, not really, really around 5 or 6 May when it really did begin. This is a full-on air interdiction campaign. So what we see is you see transportation targets targeted all across Romania, but particularly the lines going up north to the front lines. So from Bucharest, Ploiesti, all the way up to the front lines. But then you also see the main rail lines going out towards Yugoslavia as well being targeted. They're targeting bridges. They're targeting marshalling yards. And RAF Group 205, as a part of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, is mining the Danube River quite extensively. And what you see an overall decline in barge traffic, both by rail and by sea. And in fact, more barge traffic is being put on the Danube River because they'd rather risk the mines because of the extensive damage being done to the rail network. Now, something that JCE Luard noticed when he was doing his planning for this is he noticed that Romania was particularly susceptible to attacks against the rail network because there's only so many, because of the mountains and because of the terrain. It doesn't have very many major rail networks in it. So you can really, when you compare it to France and Germany, you have to kind of go at major different rail lines all over the place. This one only has like 1 or 2 big ones, and then you knock those out. You force them off on all these auxiliary lines that are unreliable, sometimes incomplete. You put them off. You put them onto the highways, and if you put these guys onto the highways, that works for you as well. Because if they have to use motor transport to move the supplies, you're digging into the oil crisis. And so basically, it's this massive interdiction campaign with an attempt to try to basically isolate those 3 main armies defending Romania, the German 6th, the Romanian 3rd, and the Romanian 4th. I do believe there's also the German 9th in Romania as well at this time as well. And so, again, you're trying to isolate those major formations from receiving supplies and really being able to maneuver as well.
I think this might be a good point to mention the question from quite a bit earlier from Craig Farrer there about targeting intelligence, because and I know nothing about how that would work in Romania. I'm an ETO guy, so I understand we have aerial photos and reconnaissance, but what was the mapping situation in terms of Romania? What the Allies have in terms of targeting things, the information? Was there information they were getting from the ground? Were there agents there? Is it all aerial? How are these targets planned and selected?
One of my favorites that they had was a tour guide. They had a tour guide of Romania, which is one of the things they used. That was one of my favorite things to come across. They had really detailed information, though, on the Romanian rail network, and not just the Romanian, the entire Balkan rail network. I came across at the Air Force Historical Research Agency a massive just book that was basically each train station, how much freight's moving through it each week, telling you all that. I don't know how they particularly got that information. I have suspicions it may have been Ultra. I don't know. I do know that there were spies in Romania that did talk about the events, but their intelligence is, I've noticed, it's as good as human intelligence can be. Sometimes it's really spot on, and other times it's really off.
Yeah.
So they do seem to have a lot of information on the refineries, on production numbers, very accurate numbers on those, and on what's moving through those train stations and how much, and very accurate numbers on those. And I don't know how they got that. I just, again, what I've seen with the sources is that they have that information and they can track it almost as it goes down after the raids, but within a couple weeks. But I don't know where they're getting that. And again, I would suspect Ultra, but I wouldn't bet on it. Again,
it makes sense. But it also, if they had the information, if nothing else, it explains that they must have put enough effort in the time to get that information. So it was considered important. This is considered on some level of priority that they have information. So that's intelligence and the targeting. In terms of the raids in that period there, what size raids? Are we talking about massive strikes, lots of little strikes? What sort of numbers of aircraft are we talking about? And I guess, where are they coming from?
We're talking about massive airstrikes. The 4 April raid on Bucharest, we're talking about 863 tons of explosives in the target area. Again, so we're talking about hundreds of bombers being used in these strikes. Probably not to the size of what the 8th Air Force can put out, but I would say we're talking in the hundreds. Not too much higher than that. I would say you're averaging anywhere from low 100s would be a good number. Again, these strikes are pretty effective when you look at what they're able to achieve, because we do see a correlation with the barge traffic. We do see a correlation with supplies, and we see the Romanians change how they're supplying their troops and how the Germans are supplying their troops. We see some changes there during that course of time. They're still able to somehow effectively supply their armies, which, again, if you're familiar with another major Allied air interdiction campaign in Italy, Operation Strangle, the Allies always underestimated the lengths that the Axis could do to find a way to keep their guys supplied. Now, it would be low supplies. It wouldn't be great. It would basically, they would still be weakened significantly, but forcing them to retreat or collapse by just attacking the supply lines, that alone was never going to do it. But you do see some Axis resilience in trying to keep some supplies coming to the front lines.
And my next question is going to be, in terms of a frame of reference, I think a lot of people watching this will be much more familiar with the 8th Air Force bombing the Germany and the Netherlands and what have you. In terms of the danger of flying into Romania, are we talking about less flak than you would typically find in German, more flak? What's the German fighter response there? Are these is it comparable like that to the? Can you make some kind of statement about that?
It depends on
an idea.
Yeah, it depends on where in Romania. If you're going to Bucharest or Ploiesti, that's going to be bad. You're talking about probably even more flak than some German cities. In terms of resistance, almost half. Let me see. We're talking about, I'd say, around 40% of Luftwaffe forces on the Eastern Front have been dedicated to the defense of Romania. Roughly, again, this is a guesstimate. Based on the numbers that I have, but I would say approximately around 40% of what this is what Soviet air intelligence, which the Americans basically acknowledge is accurate, roughly around 40% of the Eastern Front air assets that the Germans had put on the Eastern Front were dedicated to the defense of Romania. You have an entire German air fleet there, Luftwaffe 4. You also have the Romanians who have their own aircraft as well that are fighting as well. And so we're talking about, if you're going after Ploiesti or Bucharest, the major cities and the refineries, that is going to be very intense. You're talking about lots of casualties, but also the tactics to protect the refineries and to protect the rail yards do evolve. The Romanians employ smoke screens. And in fact, in one case, you have basically the Americans realizing they can't get past the smoke screen, so they order a fighter dive bombing raid on one of the refineries, which was pretty costly as well. The 36 P-38s of the 82nd Fighter Group tried to do a dive bombing mission, and of the 36 fighters, only 12 returned to their base in Italy on the dive bombing raid.
Wow.
So again, it shows you that it's not just a tough nut to crack in terms of attacking those two major targets, Bucharest and Ploiesti. It's also evolving. The defenses are evolving, and they're employing smoke screens. And so what do the Allies do? They employ a number of tactics. They lengthen out the bomber stream, so that way they can get maybe a better shot at hitting the target. They use the H2X system and do some blind bombing on the targets as well. So again, it is an evolving defense that is very difficult to get through. But I would say the resilience of the British and the Americans to just keep going at it in many different ways.
Yeah.
Probably.
I'm glad you said it, because it isn't. There's a question just come up. It isn't just the American 15th Air Force. They're British as well. Are there other? So 15th Air Force is providing a lot of this offensive power there, but not exclusively. So the British have an investment there as well.
They have RAF Group 205. They're doing mostly mining missions of the Danube River, but I believe they're also doing some night missions as well. That I have not looked into as much as others, but that is something I would like to look into further. So RAF 205 group is the one that is contributing a lot. I will say that there is also a Soviet Air Force. I believe it's the Soviet 5th Air Army is also involved in this. They're not going after the refineries. They're trying to provide air support for the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian front. I believe it's the 5th Air Army. I need to double check that, but it's one of those. I believe it's the 5th Air Army. But
and does the 8th Air Force ever get involved?
No. They contribute in their own way, which is they're bombing the German synthetic plants. They're bombing German oil on their end, and so it helps create this cumulative effect when you have the direct attacks on the refineries. So they're contributing to the cumulative effect of they go after synthetic in Germany, while the 15th and the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces go after the Romanian and really any Balkan targets that are producing oil at this time.
But we're going to move on to the aspect of the civilians. It's something you mentioned earlier, and I think it's going to be something that the viewers will find particularly interesting. And your research on this is really fascinating. So, again, something we don't really consider.
Yes. Again, something that was kind of kicked around in March is there was a real clear refugee crisis developing in Romania in prior to the air campaign being launched and prior to the first Iași-Chișinău offensive. And what had happened was they believed that if they could basically make this refugee crisis worse, then it would lead to internal problems with Romania, and it would also lead to operational problems for the German and Romanian armies as well in terms of flow of supplies. But also they were thinking about it's going to be hard for them to retreat if there are a bunch of refugees on the roads and the bridges and the rail lines are out. And so this is another thing that they considered as well. Now the first attack really that affected refugees in Romania was the 4 April attack on the Bucharest marshalling yards and the rail stations there. There are lots of casualties from that. In terms of dead, the 4 April and the 5 April attacks on the Ploiesti marshalling yards resulted in 7,600 dead and the destruction of 46,000 homes, but 7,600 dead. And a lot of those are refugees at the rail stations trying to get out. And so a lot of the dead were refugees. There's comments that you'll see about, seeing all these dead refugees at the rail stations or just dead people at the rail stations. And this really sent shockwaves through Romania. The Bucharest raid on 4 April was a big one because it just caught Romania completely off guard because they didn't expect an attack there or the nature of it as well. But after that raid, basically there's a series of communications between Acre, Portal, and Spots on how they need to capitalize on this. This was really good. We killed a lot of refugees. We created a lot of chaos after these raids. So let's see if we can replicate these attacks. And so we see another paper developed by J.C. Luard, who basically outlined specific targets to hit that would exacerbate the refugee crisis in Romania. And some of these cities don't exactly, come off the big list name of targets, but they all had connections to rail stations and rail stations that specifically would lead out of Romania. And so, again, we see a number of targets that are outlined, and those stations are hit during the summer of 1944 as a part of the continuing campaign against Romania. So again, J.C. Lord, I'll just go ahead and quote, well, not quote, but I'll just kind of say one thing he did point out is he was specific about the destruction of bridges closer to Budapest, Vienna, and Bucharest, cutting off these bridges so that refugees cannot get on them and get out of the way of the Soviet advance. So he even looked at like specific bridges that were not just rail bridges, but also just civilian traffic bridges.
Which makes me wonder why this hasn't been explored more by historians, given that, when we talk about the other elephant in the room, which is Dresden and civilian casualties, why Romania hasn't come up more in conversation, except for Ploiesti, except for that one raid that, as I say, YouTube is full of stuff about it. And that's why I'm so grateful you're coming on, shedding a light on this, because I'm finding it absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. Richard Overy's done some about the civilian bombing of Bucharest in his book, a little bit, not extensively, but a little bit. And so has not really the civilian bombing, but if we look at Robert Ayler's book on the Mediterranean Air War, that has looked at the interdiction campaign, and he cites some of the same documents that I do, particularly J.C. Lord's planning documents. He doesn't look into the refugee situation as much. He looks more into the air interdiction campaign. But again, if we do more research on this, and I'm sure if we also start consulting more with Romanian archives, what we'll start finding is that there was an active campaign against Romanian refugees, and it was having some effect. Was it enough to tip Romania over? No, but it was having an effect on the ground,
And we talked about that before going online, is that the potential future of this is to study it from the Romanian point of view, as well as the American and to a lesser extent the German point of view, because there's more history to come out of this. And then, of course, after we turn back to oil refineries again. So, folks, we have gone back to talking about oil again. It was inevitable it was going to happen. So this is now not quite a year on, but sort of 3/4 of a year on. But things are going a bit better now. So explain a bit more about that.
Well, I date the beginning of kind of the campaign against oil as in early May of 1944. Most historians will say it began in April, but I argue that's the interdiction phase. That's one of the interdiction campaigns. But what we see here is this is a coordinated effort. It's a part of a larger effort to reduce Axis oil all across the board. The 8th Air Force is involved in bombing targets in Germany. The 15th Air Force is involved in bombing targets in Romania and in the Balkans. But also, again, to go back to RAF Group 205 group, because they're doing the mining, one of the things that is affecting is because of the air interdiction campaign, oil can't get out on the rails in sufficient numbers. So they have to go by barge. Well, then you have the mining campaign. So the interdiction campaign does kind of work with the direct attacks against the refineries. But what happens is we don't go to the direct attacks against refineries until the Soviets give us the green light. We start considering it. Spots wants to do it, but it's once we get kind of the feeling that basically we get kind of some information back from the Soviets. We get some communications that it's okay to go to refineries because the first Iași-Chișinău offensive is failing. It's not going to work. There's not going to be a breakthrough. Now, in the grand strategic picture of things, hitting the oil refineries directly works in our benefit because we're not going to be able to occupy Romania at this point very quickly. So hit the refineries, put as much pressure on the oil system as you can now, because that'll help us in other theaters of the war. And, the future, it'll help out with the future of Operation Bagration, in June 23rd of 1944. It'll help out with the other campaigns across the map on the Western Front as well. So if you go after this, it'll help create this oil crisis, even though we weren't able to occupy it with our armies. Now's the time to basically go to the direct bombing. So the Soviets give the green light. but they also kind of communicate the spots that if we ask you to switch back to air interdiction targets, or if we ask you to attack certain targets, you need to attack them. So we're okay with this for now, but we might revisit going back to the air interdiction campaign, and we might revisit going back to another aspect of targets, a different set of targets as we continue throughout the summer. So again, while Spats is kind of given the green light both from Eisenhower and from the Russians to do these direct attacks against the refineries, he's also kind of given a bit of a message from the Soviets. At the end of the message, it's basically like, if we ask you to change targets, be prepared to do so.
And that's going to bring in this whole idea of the Allies allowing the Soviets to think they're controlling things, but also us trying to present the idea that we're controlling things, us being American. It's that complicated kind of juggling of diplomacy and bullshitting in a sense, because this cooperation is finely balanced, and it's fascinating. And then of course now we have the taking on of the Luftwaffe 4 as well. So there's now a lot happening in the summer of 44.
Oh yes. What starts to happen after May, there's kind of an assessment period, and what gets kind of, I guess, piggybacked as a part of for those of you not familiar with the shuttle missions, the shuttle missions to the Soviet Union that take place during the planning of those shuttle missions, they piggyback this idea of, hey, we need to hit the Luftwaffe again. There's a German air fleet in Romania that is causing problems. It's preventing the Red Air Force from carrying out air support operations, and most likely it's also supporting and protecting those refineries and presenting resistance there. So let's go after it. And so as a part of there's a meeting at Poltava between Spatz's deputy, his head of operations, Major General Frederick Anderson, and he brings a delegation, and he is met at Poltava with a Soviet delegation. And they meet, they discuss the shuttle bombing missions, but one of the things they talk about a lot is targets. Because if you're going to do this, if you're going to convince the Soviets to let you land on their airfields and to let you do these shuttle bombing missions, you probably need to bomb targets that are of interest to them. And they bring up that we need these airfields hit. And the Americans kind of agree with it. They don't want it to deviate too much from these airfields. So you see, it's Operation Frantic. Sorry.
Because Scott Grimwood was going to say, how does this finish? I'm glad you brought this up anyway, because I was going to ask you if you hadn't.
So this is a part of the planning of Operation Frantic, the shuttle bombing missions. Thank you. I was losing. I lost the operation name for a minute, but
we all do it.
Yeah, but it is a part of the planning of Frantic, and a lot of the targets that you see in Frantic are airfields in Romania, targeting specific ones that are closer to the front lines that you'll see the Germans using. This one that you'll see is the Galati airfield that was attacked as a part of the first Operation Frantic 1. Which, interestingly enough, happens on 6 June 1944.
Which is why it probably isn't so terribly well known in that thing we've said so many times on World War II TV, is that we only seem to be able to accept one event happening at one day on the timeline. We have that one, and if there are 2 or 3 things happening on the same day, on the same week, we seem to only better process the one. And it's why some of these very important major events just seem to drop off the radar, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, and so you see, and again, I'll just throw one of the reasons why they came to this conclusion is what had been happening. You have to kind of understand what's going on the Eastern Front at this time. The Germans believed that the big blow from the Soviet Union was going to come in Romania. Army Group South Ukraine was given just about everything that they needed to defend against that blow. They were given tanks, they were given an air force, they were given everything, almost everything that was being that they could allocate, they allocated to the defense of Romania. Look at where all the previous major Soviet blows had happened. Stalingrad, Army Group South. You look at the Battle of Kharkov. Everything is in the south. As you kind of move closer, you look at Crimea, you look at at Ukraine. It's all happening in the south. So what do the Germans do? Their natural inclination is load up on the south. The bigger strategic importance to us is those oil fields. That makes sense. The oil fields we must protect. It's a logical defensive assessment. The problem is it's completely wrong, but it does affect the air war because there are so many air assets dedicated to that area. 240 of the 650 fighters on the Eastern Front are there. 970 of the 2,000 aircraft in total, and a huge chunk of the bombers are in Romania, ready to basically withstand that blow. So if you look at this huge air fleet that's just sitting there waiting for this blow, the logical assessment is we got to eliminate this if we're going to do another operation against Romania. So both sides do this. They launch B-17 basically run rate cratering missions, where basically a B-17s drop from high level, drop explosives all over these airfields, like at Galati, as you can see in the previous slide. But one of my favorites is Frantic 3, which was basically an entirely fighter shuttle mission with two fighter groups, P-51s and P-38s. They strafe these airfields, they dive bomb, and also one of them, they end up, one of the legs of the Frantic 3, they participate in Bagration by attacking and strafing a German airfield at Malek in Poland. Now, what's interesting about that one is, initially, reading the post-mission analysis, they weren't really thrilled with how the Malek raid was initially going because they strafed some stuff, they found some stuff, there was nobody there. Well, on their way back, they ran across a bunch of Ju-87 Stukas without escorts. And then you have all these fighters that are like, oh, here we go. And so a huge formation of Ju-87s were eliminated basically while they were returning back to that airfield at Malek. So again, it's a really extensive campaign to eliminate Axis air in this area. And again, I know that Malek part isn't a part of the Romanian air war, but it is kind of fascinating to see kind of how extensive these fighter sweeps are being done. And we're talking about dozens, of German aircraft being destroyed in each one of these raids, upwards to 45 to 50 at a time. So it's a pretty effective campaign.
Hmm. And then, of course, we move to the next offensive. So this is another big one.
Oh yeah, this is bigger than the first one. But what had been happening, if you look at everything that had been going on during the course of late June and early July, Spatz is getting information that he needs to start stepping up attacks on Romanian airfields. In particular, that's the one he gets asked about the most. He gets feedback about frantic operations, and they say, keep hitting the Romanian airfields. But also, you see him start going back to the interdiction as well. And so he is getting this feedback from the Soviets that say he's not told a major offensive is coming. The Western allies are not told a major offensive is coming. All they're told is start shifting your targets. Start shifting back to the airfields and keep pressure on the airfields, and also hit some of these interdiction targets again. And so you see this happening again and again. And you also see these fighter sweeps now targeting railroads, rail lines, and any kind of trains they can find. And so you see this air interdiction campaign resume. You see that the air suppression campaign to keep the German Luftwaffe kind of out of the air, that intensifies. And as a result, by the time that we get to the August offensive, the second Iași-Chișinău offensive, by the time we get to that one, the groundwork has been laid. All the major threats that had prevented the success of the first offensive have been eliminated. I will also point out that Germany did, after Bagration, start pulling panzers and tanks, panzer formations and tanks out of Romania as fast as possible to get out, to basically help kind of support the breakthroughs in Army Group Center. So that is another thing that also helps this offensive out. And so when the Soviet offensive kicks off again, this time in August of 44, it's almost a replica of the the counterattack at Stalingrad. The 3rd and 4th Romanian armies are completely blown away, and this time more extensively than had happened at Stalingrad. And the 6th Army is surrounded, but they can't retreat. The one, because of the drive deep by the Soviets, but also because because of the damage done in the interdiction campaign, they're kind of isolated. But also, I should point out, their rear's threatened because of a major coup that happens with King Michael. Ian Antonescu had been begging Adolf Hitler for support throughout the summer of 1944, begging him to send more resources to protect Romania. Because I'm pretty sure he knew that once the next Soviet blow occurred, it was very likely it was going to be over for Antonescu. And that ends up being the case. Once the situation on the ground becomes quite clear that the Soviets are going to win this thing, King Michael basically orchestrates a coup of his own government, arrests Antonescu and his followers, and immediately flips Romania over to the side of the Allies. And so now what's interesting is the Germans respond by bombing Bucharest, and they do try to get the Romanians to switch back, but they were pretty much caught off guard by this. Now, they won't let that happen again, as we'll see, in Budapest. They definitely don't let that happen. But again, here in Bucharest, Michael seizes the opportunity, removes Antonescu, and arrests him along with his followers. And now, where's the 6th Army going to go? Because their line of retreat would be south down to Bucharest. And due to the nature of the bombing, that retreat's not really possible anyways. But if you're going to count on any help from the Romanian government, it's now joined the Allies. And so the bombing campaign does contribute to that in the sense that it helps the Soviets break through, which convinces the Romanian king that it is time to remove Antonescu. It is time to take power himself and try to save what he can of Romania. But once the Romanian oil fields are occupied by the Red Army, as we see happen after the Second Iași-Chișinău offensive, that's when we see a major oil crisis that had already been building in Germany get much worse. And so, again, it's that permanent turning off of the oil. The bombing, it'll slow the flow of oil down. And because, again, something people forget about with regards to bombing, you can rebuild structures after they're bombed, And if a bomb hits a target, it doesn't mean it actually destroyed the thing you want it to be destroyed. It can destroy the building, but it may miss the actual objective. And so what we see happen here is when the Red Army occupies those refineries, it's completely over. There's no way that oil's ever getting turned back on. Whereas we see in July and in August a couple times, we do see an increase in the production of oil coming from Romania. Now, when I say increase, we're talking about going from the point of almost complete, getting shut off by the bombing to getting up to a little bit. I think 189,000 tons is what I read, but that's down from a production number of 800,000.
Wow.
So again, yes, you're increasing it in July, but you're increasing it from where you were you're in the process of going down to zero.
Yeah.
So again, what happens now though with the Soviet occupation, none of that's getting out. So again, it shows you kind of the multifaceted attack against Romania and why it's kind of joint interest to both the Soviets and the Americans and the British at the same time.
So given that it is of huge interest to all of these parties, given that these are major, these offenses, given the number of Romanian troops there, why essentially is this campaign overlooked? Why does it not register alongside other air campaigns? What's your take on that?
Well, I think with regards to the American side, I can speak more to the American side. I can speculate on the Soviet side because I'm not necessarily a Soviet expert, but with regards to the American side, one of the things that they were trying to do was prove strategic bombing during the war, prove it could work. And the oil campaign is a great example of that. And if you focus on the oil refineries, you focus on just the bombing of the refineries, you can convince basically congressmen, you can convince the politicians, if you're spots, that, hey, a strategic Air Force is viable. It works. This campaign worked. And this helps the argument on the path towards a independent United States Air Force. So again, I think there's part of that at play is if you focus on the refinery bombings and you say that the bombing the refineries is the thing that shut it all off, then that helps your argument in an independent Air Force. If you ignore the fact that the Soviet ground forces kind of permanently shut it off when they occupied it, then that if you have to include that in the argument, it doesn't help your argument when you're trying to argue budgets and for an independent Air Force. So when you look at kind of how sometimes the war is remembered, especially on the air war side, you have to remember that, Carl Spaatz, Ira Aker, Hap Arnold, all these guys had a vested interest in creating an independent Air Force. So some of the things that they emphasize, some of the campaigns or aspects of campaigns they emphasize, they do it because they want to make the argument that this is why we need an independent Air Force. For the Soviets, this is a bit of speculation, but first off, the first Iași-Chișinău offensive did not succeed at all. It was terrible. Even though they made an aggressive push, they were repelled. And the Soviets, as David Glantz in his book on the Red Storm over the Balkans, he looked at the first Iași-Chișinău offensive. There's a reason they don't want to talk about that, because it's a Soviet defeat. It's reason why it's not really covered during the Cold War period. And David Glantz, when he got into the archives, discovered about this offensive and wrote a book about it. The second one, I don't know why there's not enough attention, but you will see some things written about it in books on the Second World War and on the Eastern Front. But nobody's really kind of connected the two. Everybody's either looked at it from Romania from a ground war standpoint or an air war standpoint, and people seem to forget that both are happening at the same time. And these officers, these people who are in charge of running these campaigns, realized two things are happening at once and took advantage of it.
And I think honestly, that's what you brought tonight. That is so refreshing about this. Is it I've done it as part of Strategic Bombing Week, but it could easily have fallen within the Russian Offensive Week if I had such a week. It's as important to both. I think that's what's been so illuminating about this in terms of what people are watching. I think people have certainly enjoyed it. So, until you write a book on the Romanian Air War and connect it with yourself, what are some books? And you said David Glantz there is, and it obviously comes up as a in terms of anything about the Soviet side of things. But is there anything else about this that you recommend?
The best one that probably covers the campaign that has a huge chunk of time dedicated to the campaign would be Robert Ayler's book on the Mediterranean Air War. He's looked at some really great sources. He and I have looked at some of the same sources. But again, he's looking at the Mediterranean Air War as a whole. So he doesn't dedicate as much time as he's studied it probably as much as anybody. But the reason why he doesn't go into it as much is because he's writing a book on the whole Mediterranean Air War. But that's probably the best analysis I know out there of the campaign. Because there's not really, there are books on the Romanian Air War, on Ploiesti. There's Jay Stout's book, but that only covers the bombing of the refineries. For a more comprehensive look, Robert Ayler's book on the Mediterranean Air War has some great chapters and great information dedicated to it. But there does need to be a book that's dedicated solely to that topic. Currently, that's not my project. Hopefully that will be a project later on. But some of what I'm talking about is something that I am working on. It's connected to a larger work that I'm working on with regards to a book that, again, is currently under review with Kentucky Press.
Well, I mean, I can't wait until something like that comes out, because I feel this is like an itch I can't completely scratch. I'm now intrigued about this, and I feel semi-satisfied, but I now want to learn more. And I'd read quite extensively about the mission logs and those books of individual crews in the Ploiesti raid and some of the escape and invasion on the ground or whatever. But this is the first time I've really had it put in that context of this greater campaign, and I didn't know much about the civilians and that side of it. So thank you very much, Dr. Luke Truxal, for joining us today. So They've been really great. So I'm going to just remind people they've got coming up tomorrow, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, that was an amazing presentation. Tomorrow, Tony Redding, as I said earlier, is talking about the bombing of Germany in April 45 on a Friday. Ian W. Toll is taking us to the Pacific Theatre to talk about the B-29s bombing Japan. So we're over the course of these shows this week, we've covered strategic bombing from various different aspects and angles, and I've thoroughly enjoyed what I've learned. And we will come back to the subject of bombing in future weeks. I'm absolutely certain, because there's lots more subjects we can discuss. But right now, it remains me to say to thank our guest and thank everybody for watching. And you can come back again whenever you want, because it was really, really good. So
It'll be my pleasure.
Brilliant. So, as usual, don't forget, folks, check us out on Patreon, share what we're doing. Luke's Twitter account is in the description below if you want to make contact with him and put some great stuff on there on Twitter about the air war and air power. And I'm glad those three people recommended you. You're on my radar anyway, but that was perfect that they happened to put it in the same week and put me in my frame of reference there. So perfect. So great. I've enjoyed it tonight. So, folks, I will see you all again tomorrow with Tony Redding. Until then, have a good evening, and I will see you all again.